Do you believe that a small island nation, once colonized, invaded, and underestimated for centuries, could one day become the immovable line that even a global superpower fears to cross? It's easy to dismiss the Philippines as vulnerable, a country of more than 7,000 islands, with modest military assets and decades of internal challenges. But what if I told you that in the minds of some of China's top military thinkers, the Philippines is no longer a soft target? You probably didn't hear about what happened off the coast of Ayungin Shoal last June. It wasn't on CNN. There were no global headlines screaming, "Tension escalates." But what unfolded in the silent blue waters of the West Philippine Sea that day sent shockwaves deep into the halls of Zhongnanhai. Not because of firepower, but because of what couldn't be broken. A Chinese Coast Guard vessel, sleek and modern, blocked the path of an old Philippine resupply boat, rusty, small, and crawling forward like it had no business being at sea. They rammed it, repeatedly. Cameras captured it all. Chinese officers barked through megaphones, demanding retreat. But the Filipino crew didn't budge. They didn't raise fists. They didn't fire back. They just kept filming. And quietly, they held the line. It wasn't the ship China feared. It was the story. That old boat, BRP Sierra Madre, isn't just rusting steel. It's a sovereign outpost. It's a metaphor. And in that moment, China wasn't facing a navy. It was facing a people. A people who'd been conquered before, but who now, inch by inch, were learning to fight in a new way, one that no missile could silence. The man behind the camera that day, a petty officer named Arnell, later said something simple yet unforgettable. "If we leave, who comes next? If we back away, where does it end?" He wasn't a politician. He wasn't making a speech. But he was saying what millions of Filipinos now feel in their bones. This sea, this fight, this identity, it's no longer negotiable. This isn't the Philippines of the 90s, unsure and diplomatically outgunned. Nor is it the post-war Philippines, reliant on American backing alone. Something fundamental has changed, not just in weaponry, but in will. And the irony? It didn't begin in a war room or a presidential palace. It began with the fishermen, the farmers, the teachers, the overseas workers, ordinary citizens who started to believe that their country, though often ignored, had the right, and now the courage, to say no. This transformation didn't come overnight. It came after decades of humiliation and heartbreak, after watching Chinese dredgers turn coral reefs into artificial fortresses, after seeing Filipino fishermen chased out of their own waters, after hearing promises from powerful allies and wondering if they would ever be kept. There's a man named Reynaldo, a fisherman from Zambales, who once described the change better than any analyst. He said, "Before, we waited. Now we watch, we report, we fight, not with guns, but with proof." Proof. That one word might be why China is worried, because the Philippines has mastered a kind of modern warfare that's hard to understand unless you've lived through silence. It's not about who has more jets or ships. It's about who can expose the truth over and over to a watching world. A few years ago, when drones flew over Scarborough Shoal, catching footage of illegal Chinese fishing and blockades, global media started paying attention. Not because it was new, but because, finally, someone had the courage to show it. It was no longer a regional issue. It was a global embarrassment. And the Philippine government, once careful not to provoke, began to speak with moral clarity, not from arrogance, but from decades of learned restraint. And that restraint, when broken at the right time, made the world lean in. But the story doesn't end in politics. It never does. Because deep inside this shift is something more personal, a growing belief that Filipino sovereignty is not a borrowed right. It's not a favor from the US or a bargaining chip with China. It is, and always has been, rooted in the land, the sea, and the stubborn faith of its people. Faith. That's a word you'll hear again and again when you talk to the defenders of the West Philippine Sea. They don't talk about strategy. They talk about panata, a sacred vow. Ask any of them why they stay, why they risk their lives with nothing but radios and rations, and you'll hear the same thing. Para sa bayan. For the country. And that, right there, is the hidden edge. China may have more ships, more missiles, more manpower, but they are not fighting for home. They are not defending the graves of ancestors or the coastlines of their childhoods. The Philippines is. It's easy to forget this when looking at military maps, when comparing tonnage, aircraft, and satellite networks. But wars are not always won with numbers. Sometimes they're won with the one thing that cannot be measured, the refusal to disappear. And for the first time in generations, the Philippines is refusing. Not just at sea, but in every classroom where children learn about kalayaan. In every church where prayers are whispered for peace, but prepared for sacrifice. In every barangay where flags still wave, even when the news doesn't cover them. So the real question isn't whether China can win a war against the Philippines. The question is, what if the war China thought it would fight no longer exists? What if this is no longer about conquest, but conviction? And that conviction, as we'll see next, is now backed not just by spirit, but by a rising, unshakable wall of allies, technology, and strategic boldness that no one, not even China, predicted would come from this humble archipelago. Let me tell you how it all began. Sheila looked out over the murky waters of Subic Bay and wondered, what does it take for a nation to wake up, not with a roar, but with a whisper that turns into a wave? She wasn't a soldier, nor a defense analyst. She was a former overseas nurse, now an advocate for veterans' rights. But her journey would soon touch the shores of national awakening. Sheila returned home after 10 years abroad. She carried more than memories. She carried a quiet shame that her country, which had sent her out to heal others, so often couldn't heal itself. She found her old neighborhood changed, not in buildings or cars, but in conversations. Friends talked about sovereignty. Teachers spoke of panatag kalayaan. Even her elderly father, who once avoided political talk, now prayed at Mass for the courage to stand firm at sea. It began with small things. A neighborhood cleanup day to raise the flag in a barangay plaza, a video shared on Facebook of youth volunteers cleaning mangroves on Scarborough Shoal when access was briefly allowed. These weren't political stunts. They were declarations, quiet protests that said, "We see, we care, we are here." And then came the turning point. Sheila joined a group that invited retired U.S. Navy officers to introspective forums in Manila. These weren't policy briefings, but conversations over steaming cups of Barako coffee. One officer asked her, "What gives the Philippines strength beyond its geography?" She answered without hesitation, "The stories." Because she had seen it. The rusted Sierra Madre crew, the fishermen filming, the youth who studied maritime law online, the mothers who prayed for their sons patrolling reefs. These were voices that refused to fade. Some might dismiss them as sentimental, but sentiment, she realized, can forge steel. Across town, another figure emerged. Admiral Reyes, a military man shaped by decades of quiet modernization. He had watched past administrations chase hardware, chasing status, chasing short-term headlines. But in 2022, he began to believe that maritime strength was more than weapons. It was presence, surveillance, law, and most of all, unwavering resolve. Under his watch, the Philippines expanded its radar installations across Palawan and Batanes. They acquired maritime patrol aircraft and began training with allies, not just for show, but in real-time coordination with Japanese, Australian, and U.S. forces. But Admiral Reyes insisted on something else. Public transparency. He said, "Let the other side know we're watching. Cameras on ships, live feeds, open forums, every sonar ping, every patrol path." They began to publish auditable logs. That openness created its own deterrence, because in the age of information, fear of exposure can be more powerful than fear of fire. Sheila became a storyteller in her own right. She helped collect personal videos and testimonies, fishermen chased, teachers barred from islands, Coast Guard men out in storms. She stitched them into a short film, shared globally. It wasn't perfect cinema. It was raw and real. The world watched and felt a quiet, moral weight. Not outrage exactly, but a sense of responsibility. Diplomats noticed, allies noticed, even international businesses noticed. Orders of naval supplies and maritime drones followed. A surprising coalition began to form, unified not by strategy alone, but by shared values, respect for international law, protection of maritime rights, and the belief in peaceful resistance. Meanwhile, in Zhongnanhai and Beijing, analysts began writing memos. Philippine resilience is not traditional. It is informational. It is legal. It is symbolic. It is persistent. They didn't mock. Some were cautious. They called it China's credibility problem. Because when a superpower uses force to override treaties, block channels, or sink argument with intimidation, it loses standing. And when the Philippines repeatedly put the evidence, even small footage, into the court of world opinion, it chipped away at that standing. China's strategy, once centered on coercion and incremental annexation, began to falter. They built artificial islands and deployed missiles, but those islands were now satellites of newsrooms. Their sensors recorded every dredger, every Coast Guard ship blocking access. Every international observer came away with the same sense. This wasn't force expanding. This was resistance hardening. It's here where the narrative shifts, from conviction born of pain to confidence grounded in purpose. Admiral Reyes later told Sheila over a quiet dinner in Quezon City, "They thought we'd walk away. They thought we'd stay silent. But we didn't, and now they hesitate." He paused. "They cannot underestimate us again." By 2024, the Philippine Navy and Coast Guard were receiving advanced equipment, not just from allies, but partly funded through diaspora bonds. Overseas Filipinos, like Sheila, contributed not just in money, but in stories. They crowdfunded unmanned vessels that patrolled reefs and live-streamed their presence. They sent drones that mapped sediment changes in contested zones. They encrypted and uploaded real-time data on Chinese incursions. This was not war. It was a long game, and it was working. If you fast forward to now, you see a Philippines that is small in scale but large in integrity. A country that can't match China missile for missile, but a country that knows its truths, records them, shares them, and uses them as shields. China still has big boats, but the Philippines no longer cowers. It records, it reminds, it resists. And that quiet shift, from silence to storytelling, from doubt to documented presence, is what changed the equation. So you might ask, where does that leave China? It leaves them facing a rival they cannot demonize without admitting wrongdoing. A rival whose credibility is rising faster than any naval tonnage could. A rival who has framed the narrative not in intimidation, but in inviolable law and unbreakable will. In the next part, I'll take you behind the scenes of critical standoffs, the turning points when China hesitated, when it paused, and why. You'll meet the coalitions that filed cases in The Hague, the civil society lawyers pushing international law, and the Filipino crew whose footage triggered sanctions. And you'll begin to see why this isn't just geopolitical, it's deeply personal. Let me walk you through those pivotal moments and what they mean for the future of our seas. There's a moment that keeps playing in the minds of many Chinese strategists, one they don't admit publicly, but that quietly reshaped their posture in the South China Sea. It was July 12, 2016. The day an international tribunal in The Hague handed down a ruling that sent ripples far beyond the courtroom. The Philippines had won. The ruling declared China's expansive 9-dash line as having no legal basis. It invalidated nearly every claim China had made over the vast majority of the South China Sea. And even though Beijing rejected the verdict outright, refusing to recognize the court's authority, the impact was immediate, not on paper, but in perception. That case wasn't filed by a superpower. It wasn't argued with threats or intimidation. It was a legal punch delivered by a small, bruised but resilient republic. The lead lawyer, Paul Reichler, later said, "I've represented many countries. But the Filipinos, they had something most others didn't. They believed they were defending not just territory, but truth." And China, for all its strength, had no answer. That ruling became a permanent marker in global diplomacy. It didn't change the water overnight, but it became a thorn, a reminder that even in silence, the law speaks, and that, for the Philippines, was a moment of global vindication, one that turned its fishermen, Coast Guard, and civil society into guardians of a legal truth no bullet could erase. The years that followed weren't easy. China intensified its gray zone tactics, sending swarms of maritime militia, building bases on reefs, intimidating smaller vessels. But every move now met a different kind of resistance: documentation. In late 2021, a young Filipino pilot named Miguel captured infrared footage of Chinese ships circling Philippine-claimed waters. He wasn't even deployed officially. He was training. But his recordings, leaked by accident, became international evidence within days. Satellite companies picked up where he left off. Independent analysts began charting Chinese maritime patterns using open data. The Philippine government began to respond, not with silence, but with publication. Each tweet, each press briefing, each satellite overlay became an act of counter-occupation. Even traditional allies began to lean in harder. Japan offered Coast Guard vessels. Australia deployed surveillance flights. The United States, once cautious, invoked its mutual defense treaty with Manila, not out of generosity, but out of recognition that the Philippines was no longer waiting to be protected. It was defending itself. And somewhere between that tribunal in 2016 and those surveillance drones in 2023, China blinked. In 2022, during a tense standoff near Sabina Shoal, Chinese vessels shadowed a Philippine resupply mission. The Filipino captain radioed, "This is Philippine territory under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea definition. We are performing a humanitarian mission. We will not deviate." The Chinese ship didn't ram. It didn't fire. It waited, then backed off. That moment wasn't broadcast widely, but among regional watchers it was seismic, because it revealed a hesitation, a crack in China's playbook. They had tested the limits of control, and now they were facing something unfamiliar: global accountability. Filipino Coast Guard officers began receiving training in cyber resilience, public communications, and maritime law enforcement. But more importantly, they were taught to document. Every encounter became a record. Every harassment was a file sent to international bodies. And over time, China's narrative, that it was merely safeguarding historical waters, began to lose oxygen, because the world was watching. The Philippines, without meaning to, had weaponized attention. And in doing so, it created an entirely new front line, not one of guns and ships, but of stories, images, laws, and values. One of those stories belongs to Jomari, a 22-year-old from Iloilo who had never left the country but became one of the youngest open-source analysts in Asia. Using freely available satellite data, he mapped every Chinese vessel near Pag-asa Island over 6 months. His findings were so precise that international researchers began using his data. He wasn't funded. He wasn't trained by a government. He was just angry and careful and deeply patriotic. This, perhaps more than anything, is what China didn't count on: that a new generation of Filipinos, raised on Wi-Fi and wiretaps, would become the quiet eyes of resistance, that they would no longer wait for orders, they would act. And in a world increasingly shaped by transparency, that kind of citizen engagement is a force multiplier. So here we are. A nation still economically modest, still fighting corruption, still bearing scars from past colonizers. And yet it now occupies a space in geopolitics that no one can ignore. The Philippines is no longer asking for protection. It is demanding respect. Not through intimidation, but through integrity. And China? It now finds itself in a dilemma it didn't prepare for, a rival that doesn't escalate in rage, but in resolve. A rival that doesn't need to win battles, just hold the line and let the truth flow. That's why a war between China and the Philippines is no longer winnable in the traditional sense. Because how do you conquer a people who've already accepted that even their smallest boats, even their fishermen's voices, even their classroom debates are part of the defense? In the final part, we'll look at what this means for the future. The alliances forming, the economic shifts underway, and the spiritual backbone that holds all of it together, and why, even in the face of pressure, the Filipino spirit continues to rise. On a quiet morning in Batanes, where the waves are louder than the news, a parish priest named Father Raul ends every Mass with the same 3 words: Ipaglaban ang dangal. Defend dignity. It's not part of any military strategy. It's not written in the Constitution. But across hundreds of islands, in churches, schools, and fishing boats, that phrase is slowly becoming something more: a vow. Because this war, the one China thought it could win through sheer size and silence, is no longer about sovereignty alone. It's about soul. And the Filipino soul, after centuries of surviving invaders, disasters, dictatorships, and diaspora, does not surrender easily. Today, when you look across the strategic map of Southeast Asia, you'll see a Philippines that's different. Not richer, not more powerful, but more connected to itself, to its allies, and to its purpose. The United States has increased its military presence in key Philippine locations under EDCA, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. Australia and Japan now conduct regular joint patrols in the West Philippine Sea. Even South Korea, long focused on its own peninsula, has begun quiet defense cooperation. But what makes this network powerful is not hardware. It's shared belief that free trade lanes should remain open, that smaller nations have a right to exist without being bullied, that law, not intimidation, should rule the sea. China, for all its economic reach, is learning that influence isn't the same as loyalty. It can pressure, it can threaten, but it cannot make a people abandon their stories. Sheila now works full-time with youth volunteers who track maritime movements using AI. Arnell, the petty officer on that battered ship, has become a national symbol, not a soldier, but a witness. Miguel, the young pilot, now teaches aerial surveillance to future aviators. Jomari, the open-source mapper, recently spoke at a UN side event. They are not part of a master plan. They're the result of something more organic, a people who've stopped waiting for miracles and started building momentum. And this momentum is built not just on defense, but on identity. There's a reason Filipino flags are planted on beaches, taped onto radar towers, and drawn on children's notebooks. It's not propaganda. It's a reminder that no matter how many ships block the way, the land and its people remain. But perhaps the most unshakable foundation of this resistance lies not in geopolitics, but in faith. In every coastal town, rosaries are prayed not just for safe passage, but for national strength. In every church bulletin, you'll find reflections on stewardship, of the sea, of the land, of the future. This isn't just culture, it's cohesion. It's what makes the Filipino underdog dangerous. Because even if outmatched in arms, it's impossible to outmatch a people who believe they're defending something sacred. That's what China didn't account for. They built islands, Filipinos built conviction, they sent warships, Filipinos sent stories. They thought fear would be enough. But what they met was faith, quiet, stubborn, and enduring. And faith is contagious. Vietnam watches, Indonesia watches. Even Taiwan and Malaysia take cues from how the Philippines turned the tide, not by sinking ships, but by standing firm, by choosing visibility over violence, by making every incursion a spotlight. In the end, that's why this isn't just a battle of navies, it's a test of narratives, and the Filipino narrative, shaped by centuries of resilience and fueled by a new generation unafraid to speak, is winning. Not by overpowering, but by outlasting. So the next time someone tells you that the Philippines is too small, too weak, too fractured to stand up to China, remember this. Size does not define sovereignty. Noise does not equal truth. And wars are not always won with weapons. Sometimes they are won with the simple, stubborn decision to not move, to not give in, to say, this is our sea, this is our name, this is our home. And when a nation says that together, no superpower can ever truly win against it again. The Philippines may not want war, but it is no longer afraid of it. Because today, it doesn't stand alone. It stands awakened. If this story moved you, even just a little, then you are part of this quiet awakening. Because the more we know, the stronger we become. And the more we share, the harder it becomes for truth to be silenced. So if you believe in standing for the Philippines, not with anger but with honor, then don't just watch. Be part of this growing voice. Click subscribe now, because every subscriber makes this message harder to ignore. And please, tap the notification bell. That small click helps these stories reach the Filipinos who need to hear them most, and the world that needs to understand us better. We're just getting started, and we'll keep telling the stories that remind the world the Philippines is not afraid.